Thank you. I asked Gary McGinn why me, but he didn't give me a very good answer. I'm a little comfortable being here. I'm usually facing hostile audiences, neighborhood meetings, and then I thought, I'm sure by halfway through my presentation I will have that hostile audience. So my perspective is, what does the developer want? When a developer has a project, what is he looking for from the city? First, I want to disabuse you of any ideas of how a developer comes about wanting to do a particular project. Sometimes they see a demand in the market and they see that it's not being met, that the supply is not there, and so they design a project and target that market, come to the city with that idea. Other times they come across a particularly unique piece of property, and either it's a good price or it's a very good location or a combination of both, and then they want to try and fit that the right kind of project on that unique piece of property. But the majority of the time, and by majority I'm saying 90% plus, they want to do the same thing they did before, and they just want to do it anywhere they can get that approval. They want to do that because if they've done it and they were successful and they made money, they want to do the same thing again because that has lower risk than doing something entirely new and different. And risk is the prime motivator for developers. So when they do the same kind of project, they already know all of their costs. They know what it's going to cost them to put the improvements in. They know what it's going to cost to build the project. They know what they can sell it for. They're familiar with the market because they've been entrenched in it for however long that the previous project was. The only unknown factor is what kind of requirements, what kind of what kind of costs are going to be imposed on them by the city. Because sometimes those costs can be sufficient enough to kill the project. So that's why they want to find out what that cost, the unknown cost. They want to get that pinned down as quickly as possible, because then they know if the numbers are going to work. So a lot of developers have stated how they would really prefer to have a predictable situation, that they can predict that they're going to get approval from the city, and that predictability is an offset to the risk that they're going to be taking. I would argue that much more than predictability is the timing that it takes to get feedback from the city. That is the single biggest hurdle that a developer faces. If it takes so long to get through the staff process and the public hearing process, if you're looking at a year or more, markets can change, things can change, financing can change, and then you have spent a lot of time and effort and money at some point, and you end up losing that. So one of the previous speakers, Mr. Clay, I think, mentioned how there's a bit of a game going on with developers, and that's true, there is. But he mentioned where one developer had said in Springville that their process was the worst, it took too much time, and the same guy said that in Orem. Well, he jumped over Provo because Provo is the worst. And I am not joking. The only one worse than Provo is Saratoga Springs. Provo takes forever to get a project through to the point where you know what your costs are. And so you end up with, in my opinion, a lot of times you end up getting less of a development than you could have had the project been approved quickly and you extracted your blood or even your illegal, whatever that's called, anyway. So that speedy approval is critical, and I'm going to mention that again a couple of times. You know, any project should be able to be approved, except for maybe something like Daybreak, something that's vast. Any project should be able to be approved in 3 to 4 months. That's not asking for an outrageous response from the city. We found that typically it takes a year plus to get a project through that process. So that's what the developer wants. He wants a quick response. He wants to find out those numbers as quickly as he can. He doesn't really care about design, most of them. They don't really care about the city's overall plans. If they fit into it, great. If they don't, tell him quickly so he can not spend any more money. The risk money, the initial upfront money is the high risk money for the developer. And if he's not required to spend more than $4,000 or $5,000, and you can have a preliminary plan with enough detail that you can start to get some feedback from the city for spending $4,000 or $5,000, then and if he's only risking that much, then you know you're in good shape. If he starts risking 20, 30, 50, even $100,000 and finds out that he can't do the project, then you got problems. So what does the city want in this process? The city wants good development, whatever that means. Sometimes I'm convinced that city council thinks good development is urban sprawl. It's large lots, single family, low density, and in some cases that is a good development. And urban sprawl isn't really good for the city in any situation, but there is still a demand out there, a market demand for urban sprawl. There's also a demand for good development that is not sprawl. I'm convinced the city council knows a good development when they see it. They've seen the presentations today. They know a good development. We saw some great developments here just a few minutes ago that really can work well. So what are the tools the city has to get the good development? Well, first I would agree with some of the previous speakers. Your general plan is your first document that gives you a direction and says to the public, this is the direction we want to head. One of the things that I have a concern about is Provo City's general plan isn't very general. You can actually see an individual lot on the general plan and see what the general plan calls that lot to be. That's not a typical general plan that I've seen in other cities. The general plan is kind of a broad brush approach saying this area is commercial, this area is low density residential, and they don't actually pick out the lots. We just went through the other night a request to rezone a piece of property and amend the master plan for a piece of property that was for Marvelous Catering, who was on Columbia Lane. It's a commercial area. Over time, the owner had bought a couple of single-family lots next to him. In that process, he's always worked with the neighborhood chairman saying this is our long-term goal. We had to go through a general plan amendment, which in Provo can only be done twice a year, and then a rezoning. The general plan amendment was a bigger deal than it should have been. You shouldn't be able to look on a map and see your particular piece of property and see what you're in the general plan. You should be able to do that with a zoning ordinance and the zoning map. You actually have two zoning maps. One's the general plan and one's the zoning map. They're virtually the same. The general plan is designed to give you an idea of what you want to do in the future, or in some areas where it's already developed, you just kind of cement that in, that this area is going to stay as it is. But what you want to do in the future, and maybe the zoning isn't there. The general plan says this is the direction we want to go, but you're not zoning it yet. The second tool is obviously the zoning ordinance itself. And I generally agree that the zoning ordinance needs some work. It's a pretty good document, but it's dated. Land use codes are not used that much anymore. The nice thing about zoning is you can take your master plan and you can either zone properties in a what we've been calling pre-zoning, and you open the door up for developers to do some things, and that is a very useful tool, and I think that's a good thing to do. But also, the third tool is the rezoning, where you would wait. The zone is inappropriate for the long term for a particular piece of property, but you don't zone it until you see the development that you like, and that's the zoning process. There isn't either use this or use it this way. It's do both. Certain properties need to be master planned but not zoned. Other properties need to have the encouragement of already being zoned. So part of that just comes about in what the city wants to accomplish. What we found in zoning, when we go in for most of our projects, we have to have rezoning because we never do anything easy, is that we sometimes have to create a new zone to do what we want to do. Years ago, the city would use the PRO zone, the PRO zone, and you could match the zone to your particular development. That just started making the zoning ordinance get fatter and fatter, and probably a little less easy to administer. And the majority of those changes in the PRO zone, by far, were setbacks and parking requirements. Just those two things. Ours weren't that easy. The ones we did were a lot more complicated, but it ended up being kind of a default way of getting a variance for parking or setbacks, which isn't the proper use of the zone anyway. But creating new zones takes time. That's something that slows the whole process down. When you have to create a new zoning ordinance, adopt the zone, hold the public hearings, adopt the zone as part of the regulations, and then go back through and apply to have that zone that's been adopted applied to that particular piece of property. One other thing, one of the previous speakers mentioned that rezoning should probably be a rare occurrence, and I don't know. You can argue that both ways. If you're using the rezoning to get the kind of project you want on a particular piece of property, it's not a bad thing to hold off zoning and only zone it when you got something you like. Like he said, you bring in the neighbors when you want to rezone it. That's not a bad plan. You've got to work with the neighborhood system in Provo anyway, so you can't convince the neighbors, then you really shouldn't be in there trying to convince the city council. However, I want to have something else to say about that. The last tool that I'm using here is the approval process. If the process is quicker, you will end up getting a better development. Right now, honestly, the process takes so long that the developer ends up just compromising down to whatever he can get approved, and I will show you an example of that in just a minute, and just gives up fighting, and you end up with less of a development than you could have had. I don't know if I've got slides or... I wanted to show 3 different developments that we okay. I'm not going to take the full 60 minutes, so we're going to be ahead of schedule here.
While we're waiting, Dave, why don't you talk a little bit about those costs that developers incur just to roll the dice? You know, you're talking about trying to keep your costs down to $10,000 to $20,000. I was never, I guess, as good as negotiators you were, because I never was able to keep my costs down that low.
Well, what you need to make an application is the city has a list of things you have to include to make your application for a site plan approval or a rezoning. And like I say, typically you're looking at the rezoning. You can have a pre-application conference with the staff and get a lot of information just with a preliminary site plan, some basic engineering that, yeah, this is going to work. They don't draw the lines in, the water lines, the sewer lines, storm drain. They look it over. They say, yeah, we can figure out a way to make this work. And you can usually do that for $3,000 to $5,000. Now, to make a complete application, now if the staff tells you right then, no, we can't support this, you're going to have a fight, then most developers just walk away because they're not going to spend any more money on something where they have a fight. If they're fighting the staff and they're fighting the neighbors, they ultimately will be fighting the city council, and the city council's the final say. So, yes.
Does the policy need to change then about the developer who does not get staff approval or wants to keep pushing it all the way through the council? Does the policy need to change?
Well, that developer's an idiot, and he'll go out of business anyway. If you're fighting with the staff, you're fighting with the neighbors, you're going to be fighting with the city council, and you will lose. Well, I guess there are exceptions. But like I say, he won't be around that long. Not a good developer. Okay. No, let's skip that one for the last. I'll save the best for last. Oh, good. Oh, okay. That's good. This is a project called Gables at Grandview. This is a project we did several years ago. We started and just finished up this year. This was a project, actually a part of a 50-acre development that we did in Grandview. We bought the Lunsford Orchards from Clyde Lunsford on a series of options. He didn't want all the money all at once, and he liked me, and so we were able to develop this. We did everything else in urban sprawl, but again, that was the market that people wanted that. We kept out 8 acres in the center to do a planned development. We used the planned development ordinance. We had to tweak it in order to do this particular project, but the staff helped us with getting that ordinance amended, and we were able to get this through the city. So what we had arts and crafts as a style that I've always really liked personally, and so we took 26 of these units in this little area. We did a common area with a trail and a water feature down the middle of the project. And then if we can go back to the site plan or the plat map. Yeah, okay. So what we did is there's four, there's four houses here, and we have a collective drive that comes in that services those houses. In most cases, the garages did not face the front, did not face the street. You came into the side. This is the common open space area. We built a clubhouse and pool. This took us a year to get through the approval process. Part of that, however, is that we had to tweak the plan development ordinance and make that amendment before we could apply that. So that one didn't hurt so bad, and we owned the property, so we weren't out there with a lot of money sticking out. We'd already paid for the ground. Okay, so we just kind of roll through this, and you can see what kind of house. We all did one level house. We were looking at human scale and the arts and crafts concept. That's it, right? Oh, okay. So there's one of the common driveways with the garages facing off that common driveway. Hope these aren't my pictures because they're not very good. Okay. The next one is Trellis on the Green, which is a senior project. This is the one that I mentioned where the developer finds a particular piece of property, falls in love with it, and wants to develop that particular property in the best way he could. That one is one we worked 10 years to buy this property. And so this is on the south end of the Riverside Country Club Golf Course. It accesses on off of 200 West. It's 42 units. It's an age-restricted, 55 and older community. So just roll through that. That's the front. Over here is the lap pool. It's enclosed. The porte-cochere. It's 3 stories. Most of the units are 1,800 square feet, 2 bedroom, 2 bath. The top floor units have a loft with 18-foot high ceilings. Gorgeous views of the golf course. We also, at the time we were doing this, we were able to take money from another project and buy the property because we had to do it quickly when they finally decided to sell. And it took us a year to get through the approval process. We did this one in the Pro Zone back then. There isn't an ordinance right now that you could do this in Provo. We have an exercise room. I guess, anything else? Okay. Yeah, these were condoed. Well, they haven't all sold out yet, but we sold enough of them before the crash hit that we were able to get rid of the bank and just sit it out and wait through till the market started to come back.
My question really was on demand for this kind of.
I think there is a demand, yeah. We're fairly pricey. So I think if we were 40 grand cheaper, we'd be selling them like crazy. But I'm not going to do that. But we only have a few left anyway, so. Is that it? Let's go back to let's go back to the Osprey. Okay. Now this one is pure and simple urban sprawl. This one went through the city council, 6-8 months ago. This is not one I'm proud of, but the reason this project happened is we did not have the financial capability to hang on to this property. We were able to get an option on the property, and we got a 1-year option from the landowner. 6 months into the process, we could tell that it was going to take longer than 6 more months to get the approval. So we were able to negotiate for a slight increase in price, another 6-month option. Oh, excuse me, 9-month option. It took us a year and 3 months. We were down to the day of when our option would have expired, and when we had to pay the seller. We wanted to do a mixed use, smaller lot, and a senior housing product in the price range that I was just commenting, because having done these other projects, I knew that market was there. So what we wanted to do is take a chunk of this property right here and convert that into a age-restricted 55 and older senior product. Main level living, no basement, 16 to 2,000 square foot unit, some variations in the size that way. And then modify the balance of the subdivision with some smaller lots. And we thought we'd have a chance at that, but the master plan was being reviewed, and density was the overriding criteria. And 3 units an acre was 3+ units an acre, 3.2, 3.5 was all we were going to get. Our argument was seniors don't travel at peak hour. They will not cause additional traffic problems. They travel off-peak. They either go early or they go later after everybody else has gone to work. And the other peak hour in the afternoon, the same thing. Seniors, they don't need jobs. They have time to volunteer. They are an asset to the community. This particular neighborhood didn't have a lot of seniors in it. They would have been able to be absorbed into the overall community. But since we didn't have the capital to buy the property outright and go through the longer fight, we gave up and did what was legally allowed, which was the urban sprawl subdivision. This lady.
Under the existing zoning where you have to do acres, is there a way to possibly them have a common or a common building?
Yeah,
kinds of things?
you have to do like a planned development zone, an overlay zone. No. And part of that is, I have never, the staff may know better, but I have never seen a zoning ordinance that can give you all the different regulations to make something the design turn out right. It's like, you get these specific lists of things you have to do that you check off, and it's supposed to look right, but you saw the slides of the previous presenter, sorry. You saw the difference between something as minor as the layers of personal space and somebody else just trying to copy it but not knowing what they were doing. Good design is that way. You can't, in my opinion, you can't come up with a checklist that guarantees good design. Yes, sir.
Would you be more in favor then of a form-based code rather than just strict zoning?
I would love a form-based code.
How do we get the political will to our point?
I think this meeting here is an indication that you've got some political will. You've got council members that want to see good design. And when they're given this to approve and we meet all the requirements, they kind of have to approve it. This was not something we wanted to do. We would have been way over 3 units. We'd have been 4 plus units, but my argument is that's irrelevant. We focus way too much on density and way too little on design. He's doing, 7 units an acre? 7 units an acre, and it looks great. So we've got to get away from calculating the density. Melanie? Huh?
Did you say this was approved?
Yes, we got it approved, and we were able to, it wasn't double escrow, but we were able to get the money from the people we'd sold it to in order to pay the buyers, or the sellers.
Can you change your design now?
No, it's already sold. Yeah. We just, okay, and one last dig. After we had our final, This took us a year and 3 months, and it took 10 reviews from the staff, 10 separate reviews with changes that we had to make each time around. After the final approval was granted, and we had actually sold the property, signed the documents to sell the first phase. We didn't sell it all, we sold the first phase. The new buyer was confronted with $200,000 worth of additional off-site improvements that had never been discussed before. Yeah. And again, those were legal requirements. They could have just told us that that had to be done this certain way. They weren't extracting anything. But what we ended up having to do is nobody's going to sue the city when you're trying to get your construction team out there. So you just, and we wouldn't have won anyway because it wasn't. But anyway, we snuck through this approval with a 4-3 vote, not because, the three that voted against it, not because it was urban sprawl, because it was too dense. Okay. So one other thing I wanted to just bring up, and then I'll take any other questions, and we'll be done. We'll be done early. The neighborhood organization is a great organization in Provo, and the neighbors have extracted better developments from the developer than I think the city has done. It's the neighbors pushing the developer for, who needs their support. Because if you're going to fight with the neighbors, you're typically going to lose. If you've got the staff on your side, you sometimes might make it through, but when you've got the neighbors against you and the staff against you, you don't. Yes, sir.
Well, I've seen it where the developers, they'll sometimes pay lip service to the neighborhood because it matches the zoning, and therefore they don't really need to get anything rezoned or anything adjusted, so they can put whatever they want.
Once the zoning's there, yeah,
Dave?
you've lost a lot of leverage.
Could you repeat what the question,
Oh, I'm sorry.
just so everybody can hear?
Sorry, so,
No, it needs to be in the mic. So Dave,
I was saying that, if something is already zoned, then a developer doesn't need to get the neighborhood input needed, only if it needs to be rezoned, correct?
That's right. And so that's one of the cautions you should weigh on how much zoning you want to already establish to encourage development, which I think there is certain areas that would really be a good idea. And then on the other hand, holding off on that zoning until you get what you want. So the neighborhood meeting that you have, we typically have 2 or 3. On this one here, we had 3 different neighborhood meetings. The neighbors almost always tend to focus on density rather than design. So we got nowhere by saying we'd rather take out 40 of these units and put 70 retirement, and they saw 30 unit increase, and so we can't do that. But I found that you can usually get through the neighborhood meetings and work out something with the neighborhood that they can live with, and that most of the people, if you've got a good plan, if you haven't got a good plan, you're dead in the water. But most people can see a good plan, can recognize it, and can support it. But once you've persuaded the majority, those people don't bother to come to the meeting. Yeah.
I recently was a neighborhood chair, and one of the things that we did when we didn't have any developments pressing on us, we went on a couple of walks. We walked around other neighborhoods around ours, and we walked around our neighborhood, and we looked at, I'm kind of Dixon, downtown area, and we looked and we said, okay, here's one example of higher density. What do we like about it? What do we not like about it? Here's another. And it is amazing. I convinced myself, or I learned a lot myself on it's not density necessarily as much as design. There was some really well-designed density that all the neighbors looked at that and said, you know what? We'd welcome that in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
We'd walk next door, and then here's another thing that may have been less dense. We said, this is something we hope to avoid.
Yeah. How many of you know the Harmon House that's on Center Street in 150? That is a multiple residential expansion that Dave Harmon did on that. He did a first-class job. The reason he did is he had to come to the city council, and they said, well, can you do this? And he said yes, and then he followed through and did that. That multiple residential type unit would work in some of the pioneer neighborhoods that don't want multiple residential because the ones they have are ugly, but so the design, the scale on that is amazing to me. The scale on that is so low that it doesn't feel like it's a 3-story building, but it is. And part of that is a flat roof and a low parapet, all these things that good architects like Scott can figure out. And you can make something fit into those pioneer neighborhoods.
I'll talk with the neighbors if you'll talk to the developers.
I don't like developers, and most of them don't like me, even though I are one. So my point I was getting to before you guys interrupted me was that once you've gone through the neighborhood system and worked with the neighbors and got at least a significant number of people that recognize what you're trying to do and can support it, they don't bother to come to the hearing, and only the rabid neighbors that are just that you can't convince. And we had on this one, we had 5 to 6 neighbors that were so convinced that this was the end of the world that we barely even got urban sprawl approved. So at some point, the council needs to be tuned in well enough with the neighborhood chairman and to know that you sometimes have to override the flat-out crazy people. Any other questions? I could ramble on, but rambling isn't a good thing. So, and I promised Bill I'd finish early. Yes.
Is it possible in code to develop community gathering spaces like Ross Chapin put in his?
Oh, yes.
I think that would be great. That's all.
No, you can do that kind of stuff. And you even have an ordinance right now, the PUD ordinance will mostly accommodate that kind of thing. But there's other aspects of your zoning ordinance that need to be updated.
And also make it clear that a church isn't the community gathering space, because in my specific neighborhood, we have a lot of people who are no longer or aren't using the community gathering space
Right.
as church. So some secular place would be great for them.
Okay, any other attacks? I said no heckling, Gary.
Dave, you talked about 3 projects where you had significant delay, and was wondering, a two-part question is, first, could you kind of describe in maybe a little more detail that year-long process in those projects that you went through? What the process it was. And then 2, in your opinion, how do we fix that? Is that an institutional problem in that we need to change our ordinances or the procedures that we do? Or is it an individual problem? We don't have the right people doing the reviews or going through the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't really know. I know that the bottleneck, we can usually sit down, go through the planning staff, and I'm not just saying that because you're here, and we can get good feedback, but planning's easy. These guys know what they're doing. They can see a good plan. They recognize it. They have suggestions. You can make those changes. What we found typically is the bottleneck is in the public works department, and we end up getting change after change after change. I mean, I would have loved to have 30 changes on the first one instead of 3 for 10 months. Or it's just, so I don't know. I think it's procedurally. I don't think it's personnel, but I don't know how to fix it. But it really does give you a less quality development. Even when the developer wants to do a better job, they don't dare. Melanie?
I concur with that. I have suggested for a long time that there needs to be a developer complaint file kept that the council can look at, because there are I have suggested for a long time that the city maintain a developer complaint file, that developers who are required to do things far beyond what they have thought they were going to be into can keep a file. And if you end up having one inspector or one department that is regularly having complaints, then you know there's a problem there. You don't have to open those complaints to the public, but I do believe the council needs to know that. The council approves projects in such detail sometimes, you know, down to the color of the paint and then they think they're done. And then months later, city departments come back, stormwater, power, sewer, somebody else, roads, somebody else comes back with more and more and more requirements that developers have not contemplated. He talked about the $200,000. It happens all the time. Post-approval, that a developer is required to do many more things than was counted upon, and that's part of the delay, and that's also part of the headache. I think you need to have a file so that those complaints can be documented, and developers can do that without reprisal, without fear of reprisal. The city's not going to get down on them if they say, hey, I was just asked to do some unreasonable stuff.
Dave, can you tell us the one or two or three things you think would be most helpful to fix in the code? One of them you said the general plan amendment process only being twice a year.
Well,
That
no,
seems-
I actually don't think the general plan needs to be changed that much. The general plan map drives me crazy because it.
Procedure that you can only ask for a general plan amendment twice a year.
Right, and that.
Ordinance requirement, the duty should be.
Right.
That's what I'm asking you.
If the general plan map was vaguer, was more vague, I think, is the right term, then the city council could interpret when the rezoning request is being asked, you know, because I don't think anybody would have said, well, gee, Jack Marvell, we gotta change the general plan, because it didn't make any sense. You know, the neighbors had been informed. Before he even bought the place, he talked to the neighbors and said, at some point, I want to buy this house to ensure that at some point I can tear it down and expand my parking. And they were saying, well, great, yeah. When you do it, can you do this? And by the way, will you cater our young women's thing? So I don't know. I'm pretty much brain dead now anyway.
Dave, thank you. Very wonderful presentation. I'm a neighborhood chair. I've wrestled with the issue of the multiple steps, and the text amendment to the general plan, is that the right terminology, is the first step. And it's interesting, if there's neighbors that are not interested in a project, they will demand very high, I want a detailed traffic study of this intersection for the text amendment. Well, that backs developers away because no one's interested in spending that money. I would like there to be a smoother process to get through the steps. There are two major steps. There's three steps: the text amendment, the zone, and the project plan approval. Mm-hmm. The text and the zone go to council. The other one stops at the planning commission. But there's the old beachhead concept. We don't want to let anything happen because we're giving them a beachhead. And that really frustrates developers, in my opinion. I don't think all developers are good guys, but all neighbors aren't good guys either. Neither are neighborhood chairs, as a matter of fact. But I'm just adding to what you're saying. It would be nice to have a little smoother process for that first step, and neighbors not feel like, oh, we've just given up a beachhead and we're now going to be taken advantage of by the developer. Yeah. So it takes a a combined effort. I mean, the city can't do that alone.
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you for letting me make a comment while your brain's recovering.
Yes.
Just one last, these never work for me. Just, see? Okay. Just one last comment. I'm not good with these things. Don't you think what was presented to the neighborhood in this case, that right there that we see on the screen?
Mm-hmm.
Well, no wonder they said no. People need to be, and I know this is going to sound maybe a little silly, but don't you think it would be better if there were renderings that show layers in any development, you know? And I think if there's more showing of those layers where you take away, because it has a way of camouflaging density, when you can make it look beautiful in a rendering or whatever, and then follow through with it in the plan, I don't think we'd be focused so much on density as much as design. And I think sometimes in neighborhoods, you can't take away the impact, but if they could, the totality of the impact, but if there were renderings that were very, very good, I think it would diminish the concern of impact, because that would suggest that that was already on the mind of the developer, on the mind of the architect, on the mind of whoever is pitching this, that the developer isn't out to uproot anyone's life, to change anything so drastically like that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That, oh my gosh, I'm losing, when, stop that, when, when all we have to do is just be a little bit more visionary, let them see what's really coming, stick to that plan 100%. And I think it will take, I think the correlation between impact on the neighborhood, and usually that's what density is all about.
Yes.
It's about what's
the
going to
impacts.
happen to
Mhm.
us.
And usually traffic is the
Exactly,
first.
and traffic comes with it. So I think if those things could be put to rest with pictures, everybody loves a picture book, you know, I think we'd go a lot further and actually take less time. So there might be more time on the part of developing those things, you know, the renderings, whatever, but ultimately it could very well speed the process.
Mhm. Any other? Okay, thank you.